and welcome to the Cheer Up Podcast. I'm your host, Kara Hunt, and with me, as always, is my wonderful, beautiful co-host, Sherry Swawa. How are you today, Sherry?
I am doing fantastic. How are you, Kara?
I am having a blast because today, not only do I get to talk with one friend, I get to talk with two. So, also with us today is the amazing Pegg Thomas, author extraordinaire, Pegg Thomas. So, how are you today, Pegg? How's things going?
I am doing well. As things are going right now, I'm very busy, both writing and editing and keeping the words coming.
Okay, so speaking of Pegg being busy, she's not lying. Okay, so not only is she a Reader's Choice Award-winning author, she's also the former managing editor of Smitten Historical Romance. She has also been published in 6 Barber Historical Romance collections. She was a double finalist for the ACFW Carroll Awards for Novellas, a finalist also for ACFW Editor of the Year, and 2, not 1, but 2 of her books, Sarah's Choice and Megan's Strength, had finaled in this year's 2022 Selah Awards. So welcome, Pegg, with your busy, busy self and your award-winning self. So we are so honored to have you on here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, and she will first tell us about your 2 books that finaled in this year, double finaled. I want to say that again, highlight it, italicize it visually. So not 1, but 2.
Yes.
I was so excited when I watched that and I saw the announcement. I'm like, yay! That's my girl. It's Pegg. I was like, she got 2 in this year's Selah Award. So tell us about those 2 books.
Well, I was also very excited to hear the first book's title announced. And when the second book's title announced, I about dropped my tea. So that was very unexpected and very exciting. But these 2 books are the first 2 in my series, Forts of Refuge. And I enjoy writing historical fiction, historical romance. My books are heavy on the history because that's where my heart is. And I like to find lesser known historical events to set my stories around. And Forts of Refuge takes place during Pontiac's Rebellion, which is a war I have found a lot of people never learned about. I grew up in Southeast Michigan, not terribly far from Pontiac, although I never went there. Back when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, you didn't travel that far from home. And I grew up in a small dairy farm community in Southeast Michigan, but we had our local history that we knew. And every couple of years, I guess, in school, we would touch on local history. And Pontiac was an Ottawa Indian who staged an uprising that condensed a bunch of tribes. It brought a bunch of tribes in to fight against the British. And he was, in a lot of ways, the Jim Jones of his era. He was very charismatic. He was very strong leader. He inspired people to follow him, really just based on his personality. And he changed the landscape for a short time. In Southeast Michigan, especially, tribes that weren't from around there were coming in and joining in the fight. And so growing up in that area, I had learned a lot about it. But it happened it started in 1763, and the war didn't officially end until 1766. But it really, after the first year, there were no more fort sieges or anything. There were more skirmishes here and there. It sort of ran out of steam as time went on. But that's where I set the story. And the first story is Sarah's Choice, which was a gift. I've never had this happen before. It hasn't happened since. But God really gave me that story. And I just woke up one day, I knew who Sarah was, I knew what happened to her, and I knew what the consequences of that were going to be. I still had to find a place to set it down. I still had to find my setting and my time and everything. And I had written a novella set during Pontiac's Rebellion, and it was just such a fascinating moment in history. It's a very brutal time in history, but as always happens in those kind of times, people shine. It's a chance for the people who are the real life heroes to really stand out and shine. And it made it a fun place to put this story down because it suited the situation so well. And I chose to set that one at Fort Pitt, which was the first, of course, Pittsburgh was the first fort that was laid siege to. And I had to do a lot of research for that area. I didn't know a lot about that. So I spent about 3 months reading everything I could find. And I found a firsthand journal of one of the soldiers who was in the fort, which was great. It not only told me what was happening, it also gave me like weather reports. He would record the date something happened, what the weather was like, what time of day it happened. I was able to use that to really drive the story forward while weaving Sarah's story into it. And that was just amazing. It was a lot of fun to be able to do that. And then with the second story, Maggie's Strength, I also had a firsthand journal from the Detroit area because that story is set in Fort Detroit. And the third story, which is coming out here later this month, I hope, if everything goes according to plan, was set at Fort Niagara. And that one, there is not quite as much history to drive the story because that fort was never technically under siege, although the worst battle was fought right outside of it, the Battle of Devil's Hole. So I didn't have that, but I had a lot of other history that I was able to read and catch up on what was happening in that area to finish that story. So those books came together fairly quickly, and they were just a neat lesson for me in writing in a new style for me that I call a modern day parable, where I was able to tell the story and illustrate aspects of the Bible's teaching without actually ever mentioning it. When I think about how Jesus told his parables, he never mentioned synagogue, he never mentioned God, he never mentioned anything like that, but he told the story in a way that illustrated biblical truth. And that's what I was able to do with this series. And that was really challenging, but very exciting too.
And the one thing I want to say is, because I have read both Sarah's Choice and Maggie's Strength, and for those who do not know, I initially did not like historical fiction until about, I don't know, Peg, when did we meet? When did you and I meet?
It's been almost 10 years. Yeah,
it's been almost 10 years. Okay.
Almost 10 years.
Yeah. So, and I believe you are like the first historical one of your books is the first historical novels that I have ever read. And it was like, because to me, when I used to think of historical novels, I would think, oh, they so drab, they so dreary, and it's just all about the history. There's really nothing else to it. And then I would read some of your stuff, and I'm like, this stuff is great. And I'm like, it was so good because it was story, it was entertaining, it had a plot, it had engaging characters, it was inspiring, it was, had faith woven throughout, and it was just an amazing book. And I've been a fan. You really are the one who introduced me to, historical fiction in a way that I like it, right? In a way that's readable and, I don't know. It's just so much about it. You've just kind of like ignited a fire in me into reading Christian historical fiction. And I have read Maggie's Strength and Sarah's Choice, like I said. Tell us a little bit about Sarah's Choice, if you can, without giving away too many spoilers, because that book deals with a very difficult topic, and more than one difficult topics, actually, and it which relates back to the book's title, Sarah's Choice. She had a choice to make because of something that actually happened. And so tell us what you can, without too many spoilers.
A more correct title might have been Sarah's Choices, but that just sounded awkward. So it's Sarah's Choice.
Yeah, so there were several things that she had to make because of certain things that happened, yes.
Yeah, she had 3 very distinct choices that she had to make. And in the very beginning, she just has to choose to live. And I think that that's something that will strike people even today who have been through something horrific. The choice to just go on sometimes is a difficult choice to make when you've lost enough. That's a pivotal point in your life to just choose to go on and to not give up. So the overarching theme of Sarah's choice really is the sanctity of life. And all three of her choices point to choosing that, the choice that life is precious, and that that it's more important than anything else you're going through at that time. I believe God gave us life. That was his choice to give us life, and it is not really our choice to take it away. And that's kind of the overarching theme of Sarah's choice, but it's played out in different parts throughout her story, where she kind of has to make that choice more than once. And it was interesting to step back in that time frame where things were very primitive. 1763, they didn't have the conveniences we have now. Life was just hard. Even in the best of times in 1763, life was hard. And so the choice to move on, to go forward, to keep going was different than it is today, but it was still that fundamental choice to make to keep going, to keep trying, to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And even today, with all of our modern conveniences and our dishwashers and our laundry machines and everything else that we hardly have to break a sweat, it's still a choice that people make today and need to make sometimes more than once.
It really is. And I think that's one of the awesome points about Sarah's choice is that, yes, the event took place in 1763. And it was such a long time ago. But it doesn't change the fact that even though we're now in this particular year, it doesn't change the fact that people still deal with those type of issues, like you said, And
that's one of the beauties of historical fiction is that people don't change, and God doesn't change,
and neither do circumstances.
Yeah, well, the window dressing changes. Obviously the technology and things change, but people at their heart are as people have always been. God is who God has always been. And so being able to look back and realize that what our ancestors went through was different, yes, but it was also the same. It brings sort of a continuity to life.
It does. And I love what you said, like it was a different but the same. Like she I'm trying to, without giving way too much, she just because the book series is called Forts of Refuge. So she seeks refuge somewhere, which automatically tells you that she was in a really difficult, devastating position, right?
Right.
She saw, lived, witnessed some of the most atrocious things that a person could witness and experience and then still survive. Right. And she had, and she goes to, did you say it was it Fort Pitt?
Yes, she's in Fort Pitt.
She went to, right. She went to Fort Pitt, for refuge there and everything else. And she went there with a secret because she did not know how people were going to, really respond pretty much,
right.
Once she got there, and everything else. And so she witnesses all this devastation. She experiences a lot of it, and everything else. And yet that speaks true to today. Okay. We're not at war with the Indians, obviously, anymore. And those type of things are going, but we are at war with other things in our lives, And so, like you say, even though it was then and now, same but different. And that's one of the amazing things there is that she goes there, and then, as the story goes on, she realizes, oh my goodness, I have this to make. One of the second topics is sanctity of life. people still have to make that choice today.
Yes.
That is something that they have to, do I need to keep? Yeah.
And it's not just the abortion issue. I mean, a lot of people think of sanctity of life as meaning just the abortion issue, but it's not. Sanctity of life also involves euthanasia. And to me, it even involves how we treat the elderly, how we treat the mentally unstable, how we treat these people who deserve to have their dignity intact, deserve to be treated respectfully, even as they, my dad died of Alzheimer's, his mother died of Alzheimer's. It's a horrible thing. I would never wish that on anybody. But to me, that also included in the sanctity of life is treating them still with respect and with dignity and not isolating these people just because they're going through what they're going through. It's more than just the abortion. It is the abortion issue too, but it's more than that. I think we need to sometimes as Christians broaden our scope and realize that the sanctity of life brings in a lot of things. It brings in the issue of suicide. It brings in
I was just going to say that. Yeah. Because when you witness such horrific things and you're part of that brutality, then suicide is obviously an option. It's like, why? Why even go on? Right?
Yeah.
I've lost everyone. I've lost everything, and everything else. You get that. Why do I even go on? But it's that sanctity of life. We didn't give it. We can't take it away, even our own.
Right.
And so it really covers, some really difficult things in there. And I have yet to read one of your books without learning something. The different Indian tribes, most of them I can't even pronounce correctly.
That's okay. Most of them have several pronunciations because up here where we live, the tribes all had a name given to them by the British and a name given to them by the French. And sometimes they're very close. The British called Pontiac's tribe the Ottawa. The French called it the Adawa. So those two are very close. We have the Ojibwa in French, and in English it was Chippewa. And they're similar. But then you have some that are completely different that don't seem to match at all, and yet they're the same tribe. So it gets very confusing sometimes. And I want to mention that because writing about the Indian tribes is a touchy subject right now. And in Sarah's Choice, my hero and heroine are both British because there was no United States at that time, right? We were all British. And so they were both British. And I wrote it from their point of view. And they were not, obviously they were afraid of the Indians. Okay. The Indians were the attackers at this point in history. And so they're very fearful of them. But I also show that not all the British or the colonials were pristine either. There's good and bad in everybody. We can't say that one whole race is bad or one whole race is good, because if we did, then we make them not human. Human beings are good and bad.
Right.
No matter what your color, what your background, where you were raised, it doesn't matter. Human beings are sinful creatures, and we have good and bad in us. And so I needed to show that. In Maggie's Strength, which is the second book, my hero is French. And so that's a whole different perspective. The French were very friendly with the Indians at that time. In fact, a big misconception is that Pontiac's war was to drive the white man out. And that was never the case. Pontiac wanted to drive the British out because he wanted the French to come back. This is after the French and Indian War. The French lost, and they left, and the British moved in. And the British had the gentle touch of a lumberjack. I mean, they were just so ham-handed about how they handled everything. They were just arrogant and domineering, and they figured they won the war, so they just owned everything and everybody. And I try to show that in the book, that they just handled it very poorly. And so Pontiac wanted the British gone, and he wanted the French to return, because Pontiac was also very smart. And he knew they needed guns, and they needed gunpowder, and they needed stuff that they could not make themselves. And the French were willing to give them to the Indians and to trade with them, or just they gave a lot of gifts. they were very willing to work with the tribes. And so Pontiac wanted the French to come back. So he was not anti-white. He was anti-British. And that's an important distinction to make. And that sets up book 2, because my hero in book 2, whose name was Baptiste Giraud, he was really caught between two worlds. He was very friendly with the Ottawa, but he was French, and his country had abandoned him. And what they did, he either had to return to France with them, where he'd never been. He was born in this country, or he had to swear allegiance to the British crown, which he did, and most Frenchmen did, with their fingers crossed behind their back. They had no intention of really becoming British. They just didn't want to leave their land.
Right.
And so he's really in between. He's what I like to say, right between a dog and a fire hydrant. And his life is difficult for that reason. And then the heroine was British, but she was captured as a child and was raised by the Huron Indians, also known as the Wyandot, depending on if it's their British or their French name. And so she was raised in a tribe. And so they're bringing two very, very different perspectives into the whole series. And in the last book, the one coming out soon, is Abigail's Peace. And my heroine is British, but the hero is a Seneca Indian, because the Seneca was such a fascinating tribe during this time. They were the only tribe that I found in my reading who split over this conflict. Half of the Seneca stayed out of it, and half of the Seneca fought for Pontiac. So finding a character in that tribe was a way to really explore how this conflict was tearing the tribes apart. They didn't all fall in line with Pontiac. Some did, some didn't. So that allowed me to show another aspect of the whole conflict.
And that was amazing, because especially in Maggie's Strength, because from like what I had learned through school and everything, kind of through history, was that all of the tribes were in line with Pontiac. And then you see it from your research and from your point of view in the book that not all of them were.
Yeah, they weren't.
Yeah, not all of them were. And everything, but he was such a charismatic leader, and everything else. And he just, I love the example of how you give, like, he was a Jim Jones of their day,
He was. Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of them, they were behind him in the beginning. They loved everything he was saying and the things that he wanted to do. But then as time went on, they started seeing other things that they didn't like, basically.
Right. Because
and that they didn't agree with.
He bullied a lot of the tribes to join them. I mean, those who would not follow his leadership and his charisma, and like I said, he was very intelligent. He was everything I've read about him said he was well-spoken, but also very intelligent. But if they wouldn't fall in line with him, he was not above threatening the other tribes. He threatened the one Huron tribe. You either come and fight with us, or I'll send my warriors here and we will kill you. And that is that was recorded by a Jesuit priest who probably lived with the Huron tribes. We don't know for sure where he came from, but we're thinking, because the Jesuits, the French Jesuits, had people living within the tribes. They came over to evangelize to the tribes. That was the whole purpose of the Jesuits. And they lived with the tribes, and they were respected. And the Jesuit who lived with the Hurons was very much a respected man. And in fact, Tita, who was the chief of that particular tribe, told Pontiac that he had to wait until this particular Jesuit had performed a mass before he would send his warriors to fight. And Pontiac agreed to that, which was interesting. Pontiac actually agreed to wait for the mass to be performed. So yes, he was cunning, he was smart. He was not necessarily well loved towards the end. He was actually murdered in the end in 1769 by a Peoria Indian who was very unhappy with him. Because as the war went the other way, I mean, as the British started overwhelming with their numbers and their munitions and just everything they had to overwhelm with, some of the other tribes got very hostile then towards Pontiac, I guess, from what we what we know of piecing it together. We don't really know what the argument was that led to him being murdered, but he was killed by a Peoria Indian. So,
and see, that's, yeah, because I think I remember learning in school, how that kind of part ended up. But it's just so amazing to see that it wasn't the British or anyone like that killed him. It was one of his own. It was another Indian tribe.
Yeah. It was from a completely different tribe, and you have to remember, these tribes were not peaceful to each other.
Right.
These tribes were very hostile to each other in many cases. They fought over the land too. They fought together over boundaries and hunting lands and wintering, all that type of stuff. So it was more like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that's why they came together to fight the British. But when that didn't work, those old hostilities, of course, were still there. And still had to be dealt with. There was one leader from the Ojibwa tribe who came down from the Mackinac area of Michigan, who met with Pontiac, and because of some of the atrocities that Pontiac was participating in, and I don't go into them in the book because they are really difficult to read through and to learn about some of the things that he did. That chief actually said, forget it, and packed up his warriors and went back north. He did not like the barbarism that Pontiac was involved in during the war. And so he turned around and went back home. So they weren't all, and he was a strong enough chief that Pontiac could not coerce him. He was actually the son of the head chief of the Ojibwa Nation. And so he was a very, very powerful man, and Pontiac did not go after him. Whereas Tita in the Huron tribe was a smaller village, and they had a lot fewer warriors, and so Pontiac could bully him. But he knew he was a smart man. He knew his limits. He wasn't going after the other one because he would have come back very bloodied if he tried. So there was just the geopolitical situation of that time was very intense, and between the tribes and the British. And of course, the French had left by then, but it was a brutal and interesting time.
But I'm glad that you mentioned that, because even though it was a very brutal and barbaric and interesting time, like you mentioned, you don't go into those brutalities in the books. I want the readers and everything out there, as we're talking this month about our summer reading series and some of the best Christian fiction books out there, which the Fort of Refuge series is definitely one of them. So you gotta go ahead and make sure that you get these books. But the one thing I do want to mention is that you don't cover a lot of that brutality and barbarianism.
No, I didn't.
In the books, you don't go into the graphic. You talk about what happens to like the characters personally, but you don't go into like all of the other things and everything that just happened. So it's not a graphic read for those of you out there who are like, hey, this book sounds really, really good, and I really want to get it, but there was a brutal time, and I just don't. No, none of that. It's like none of that. There's no gratuitous violence or brutality or anything like that. And for those of our listeners who are listening and saying, well, Kara, these books sound really interesting, and I like historical fiction, but you know what? I like my historical fiction with a little romance. Well, guess what? The Fort of Refuge series has that too. So tell us about the romance element of Sarah's Choice and Maggie's Strength and Abigail's Peace, as a matter of fact, because
well, it's life has romance to it. I think there's pretty much always an element of romance. My books are not bodice rippers. There's nothing like that. There's nothing salacious about them at all.
Right.
But when I figure out my characters, I figure out how they would have logically gotten together. What would have brought them together. And so, that was trying to figure out how to put this without giving anything away. Back in 1763, few people married for love. Most people married of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is still true in my stories. The one that deviates from that is the last one, Abigail's Peace. Abigail was just the first two heroes, Sarah and Maggie, are very capable women of the frontier. Maggie obviously grew up in an Indian village. She can take care of herself. By golly, she's a little spitfire, you know. Sarah grew up in Pennsylvania. She grew up actually more towards Philadelphia, but Philadelphia at that time was still kind of on the edge of the frontier, so she could take care of herself in many ways. Abigail, bless her heart, grew up in Boston, and she is clueless about everything on the frontier. But her situation in Boston was very bad, and I won't get into how because that's part of the story. She had to escape, and she decided she would get herself on a boat to Fort Niagara because her uncle Cornelius, who she calls Uncle Corny, was there, and she would go surprise him to be with him. And boy, was he surprised, and not in a good way. So here's this Boston miss who is clueless about so much of life, and she winds up at Fort Niagara on the very edge of the frontier. I mean, there's like nothing. There's nothing anywhere near Fort Niagara at this point. And she, the first thing she does is she comes off the boat, and here's this Indian man standing there without a shirt on, and she just about has the vapors because she's never seen a guy without his shirt on. You know, I mean, she's totally clueless. And I did that purposely because of the first two being so independent and so strong. I wanted to show what would happen on the other side of the coin. And so that one was really fun to play with, just her character and how she bumbled through things. And but the overarching theme of that third book is acceptance, accepting who you are and accepting who others are. And I had a lot of fun playing with that and bringing her around to thinking beyond the borders of Boston society of what life really was and what was really important. And so her romance builds much more slowly than the other two, who married more out of necessity. She's actually making the choice. She does get the choice. So it's kind of a nice way to wrap up the three set at the forts. But I will tell you, there's going to be more. I initially, this was going to be a 3-book series. That was going to be it. But I have had readers, and one of my sister-in-laws come back to me and say, you have got to write so-and-so story. You've got to write this. And I think they're right. So I'm going to have a spin-off series called Beyond the Forts. And I'm going to write about 3 character from each of these 3 at least. And that one may even go longer. We'll see. Because once the siege ends, once the danger of immediate attack ends, what happens to these characters? People want to know, and now I want to know. So I've got a series I'm working on right now. But when that one's out, I'm going to go back and revisit 1763 and 1764 and see what happens beyond the forts.
And to me, that is awesome because, especially with Maggie's strength, oh my goodness, how can I say this without giving too much away?
You liked Henry, didn't you?
Yeah, and not only that,
everybody liked him.
when you mentioned that, because you mentioned that she was kidnapped as a child by the Indians.
Yes.
So going beyond the fort to like, I want to say this, but I'm thinking, is that giving away a part of the story? You know,
I haven't read them yet, but I am going to because I can't wait now. You're not going to ruin it for me, so go for it.
Oh, okay. Because I'm sitting there and I'm going, how can I just, but if when you're doing the Beyond the Force series, which I think is a brilliant idea, because there's no way you can read just one book in this series and not wonder what happened to them afterwards, especially with Sarah's choice and the decision she had to make there, like how did those choices work out, right? And then with Maggie's strength, and then her just being reunited, per se, maybe. Like with those who, because obviously she was taken from people who loved her, right? And so I think that would be just so awesome to kind of even build upon that part of it. But you're right. Like in the first two, these are very strong, independent women. They're not your wallflowers, that's just going to melt when something difficult happens. They're very capable, even though this physically it's not that they can't do anything, but sometimes mentally, just the surroundings will kind of make you down and out because you just can't take or see or do anymore mentally, and everything. But like you say, Maggie grew up. She was kind of like being kidnapped by the Indians. She learned a lot of ways of how to survive. And that really comes, into play in Maggie's strength. So, but again, it's romance, so there are happy things in it as well. There are difficult things, but there are happy things as well. And for those of you who love romance, then you're actually going to love these three books. And I dare anyone to read them. Okay, to read them and not look forward to the Beyond the Fort series because you're just going to be like, I got to know, right? I got to know what happened to these people, to these characters. Or Sherry loves to call her characters in the books that she loves and reads. She calls them her friends. She's like, what happened to my friends? Like what happened to the rest of the story? And everything. And so, Sherry, do you have any questions before we wrap up?
I don't have any questions, but I'll tell you what, I was introduced to your writing, Peg, and I fell in love with it. And I had not had the opportunity yet to read the Forts of Refuge series, but I'll tell you what, I am going to be buying them as soon as we get off this podcast because they sound amazing. And I live in Michigan. That's not a mystery to anybody. And so I prefer to learn about history through fiction. I don't like to sit and read history books. I don't like to sit and I hate to research. I'm not a big person in that regard. I'm all about relationships. Always have been, always will be. And so it just adds another element of excitement for me that not only am I going to learn about where I live, but also the other one you said took place in Pittsburgh, correct?
Yeah, the first one takes place in Pittsburgh and the second one at Fort Detroit.
See, and I lived in Pittsburgh for 10 years of my life. So I will get to learn about two places where I've lived. So that makes me even more excited. So yeah, I am super excited. And I've always loved the history behind American Indians too. There's just something about them that just really intrigues me. And I love the fact, as I'm sitting here listening to both of you, that you're turning it all back around and pointing it back. You're giving the Christian perspective because there were Christians back then. There were believers back then. And I think that when we can read about history and the fact that, yes, it was brutal and you don't go into all the details, which we appreciate, but I'm sure there's enough in your stories to get us to where we can read between the lines. And we get hope. We get hope reading it from the Christian perspective. And that then carries over to today. And I mean, there's a lot going on in our world today. I think that history continually repeats itself. That's just a given. And sometimes I think that can be scary for different personalities, but it doesn't have to be. And that's where I'm really excited about reading your books, because I think you're going to be giving that hope to readers that the times are really tough, but there's always hope. And just like we always hear about in John 16:33, we always bring it back to that these things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Jesus is always there. He was there back then. He was there in the middle between that time period and our time period. He's here now. He was here in the Bible times. He's never going to leave. He's always a constant. He hasn't changed. He was the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so I know that it's fiction, but like I said, I'm relational and I love fiction. I love hearing about history from fiction. And I'm excited that you're offering that hope that can then be carried over into 2022. If you want to hear more about Pegg, head over to her website, peggthomas.com, peggthomas.com, and that's Pegg, peggthomas.com. She has all kinds of things over there for you to check out, and you can find out what she's written and where to find it. Kara, she has her book out right now, Paper Dolls. Go check that out. If you haven't bought your copy, please do. Super excited. You'll find her information on kararhunt.com, KARARHUNT.com. And if you want to check out anything that I'm doing, I've got some new and exciting projects going on. Check out Jesus in the Everyday. That's on SherrySwalwell.com, CHERISWALWELL.com. It's a new way to offer encouragement, and I hope you'll check it out. We are so glad that you're here. Do you need prayer or encouragement? I know we've been talking about fun things and about fiction, but you know what? Sometimes fiction can bring up things that you just need help with, you need prayer for. It can bring up memories, or it can bring up trauma, or it can bring up just different thoughts that you need healing from. And the one who heals us is Jesus. But if you want someone to stand alongside you and pray with you, head over to the cheeruppodcast@gmail.com. Let us know that you need prayer, and we will be happy to pray with you. Also, if you want to join a community, go over to Facebook and join the Cheer Up Podcast Facebook group. It's growing every day. We love the people that are in there, and we love interacting with you. Lots of different ways that we can connect with you every week. We are so thankful that Pegg joined us today. Pegg, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed today. I cannot wait to read your books, and I have read her short story in Lumberjacks and Ladies. Fantastic. So if you want to read that one as well, head over to Amazon or head over to her website, and you'll see more information about that. That one also takes place in Michigan. So fun. So thank you, Pegg. Thank you, Kara. And thank you, listeners, for being with us. Come back next week, and we can't wait to see you then. Have a great rest of your week.